Hey, welcome back. This is Shah. CNBC recently released a piece on the declining marriage rates in the world, mostly the Western world and the developed world. Let's go and watch that together and see why people are not getting married anymore.
No one knows exactly when the first marriage took place. People have been getting married for thousands of years. It's an ancient institution. But for some people, it's perhaps a bit too ancient.
89% of the world's population now live in countries with falling marriage rates. This is especially pronounced in the richest countries. Among the 38 OECD nations, most recorded between 7 and 10 marriages per 1,000 people in 1970. By 1995, this fell to around 5 to 7 marriages, and it continues to plummet today.
So why is this happening, and will it spell the end of marriage as we know it?
A stable marriage has often been associated with financial stability. Married households in the US hold significantly higher wealth than cohabiting couples or singles.
Why it's going down, I mean, off the top of my head, I guess I could think of reasons. Cost of living increases, it's harder to come up with the money to take care of a family or buy a house now. Then there's family law. A lot of guys are kind of bowing out because they don't want to deal with the system when the divorce comes. As we know, there's high rates of divorce. So some people might choose to, maybe they'll live together and have a kid, but they won't sign the paperwork. So that's a possibility. And, then you got the other stuff. You could say feminism, no-fault divorce, and all that kind of stuff. And then there's a child support system, that's given people an avenue to kind of circumvent marriage in some way, because you can get paternity established for a child without having to be married to someone. You can get money for a child without having to have first been married to someone. So I think there's a lot of reasons. I'm curious to hear what this video is going to cite as the reasons, however. I mean, there's also religion kind of taking a back seat. People are kind of like pseudo-religious now. A lot of people, they might identify as such, but how many really live by it? So there's a bunch of reasons here.
But despite this, the marriage rate in the US has dropped by nearly 60% since the 1970s. And
what's funny about the 1970s? The child support system was established in the mid-70s. Not saying that's the reason, but it just happens to coincide.
Median age for first-time marriages has increased for both women and men.
For a variety of reasons, I think upper middle class Americans are just much more likely to be kind of intentional about sequencing their lives in terms of education first, work second, marriage third, and the baby carriage after all of that. And so they're just in a much better spot, both financially and relationship-wise, when they go ahead and have kids.
The cost of marriage usually starts with a wedding. This is a tiny wedding cake I bought in London for $50, thankfully just within our production budget. But if you wanted the same cake, but big enough to serve 100 people, then you would have to pay at least $250. Add in the price of a venue, a tuxedo, a dress, drinks and music, and suddenly you're looking at a very large bill.
Getting married is just the tip of the iceberg. Starting a family adds all sorts of economic commitments. It typically starts with a house, followed by a car, maybe kids, which means more expenses like books, toys, and family vacations. In a nutshell, you become a fully engaged consumer in the economy.
Yeah, marriages, especially traditional marriages, are very expensive. And I know that's a big cost. I'd like to think traditionally both parties' families were heavily involved in paying for it, not just the two people getting married. But that's another thing. I mean, it's hard to imagine for a lot of people, especially when a lot of folks are having trouble, making rent and finding money in order to sustain themselves. Marriage definitely seems out of reach. And then same with after you get married, then you gotta get the house and start all this other stuff. So it gets tough. And then, one interesting thing is that it's mostly women that will initiate a divorce, at least here in the US. So a lot of people find themselves past this place of getting some of this stuff done, and then they get hit with a divorce anyways after this huge investment. I also think a lot of the reason people are kind of opting out is because a lot of the kids that are growing up now and becoming of marriageable age are actually products of parents who got divorced, or they witnessed their parents getting divorced when they were, you know, younger, maybe a teenager, maybe they were even younger than that, 10, 7 years old. And they kind of lived in that life, and they're just like, man, this is just a lot of extra for no reason. So there's just so much going on. It's such a complex problem.
Some people choose not to go down this road, while others simply can't afford to.
From about 1980 to the present, there's been no greater increase in family instability than there has been among this working class demographic in the US, sort of in basically the second quintile of the family income distribution. I think there are a couple of big factors here in play. So one major factor, of course, is sort of the changing economy and the way in which working class men are less likely to be stably employed.
American adults from high-income groups have maintained a stable marriage rate since the 1970s. But among the middle and especially lower-income groups, marriages declined to 66% and 38% respectively by 2018.
So, you know, okay, we see guys aren't making enough. More women are graduating from college and all that kind of stuff. But the jobs are kind of split between men and women now. So women typically, if they're making a certain amount of money, I mean, they're going to want to marry up, and there's just not as many men who make what probably a lot of them consider good money, or at least more than them, if that's what they're looking for.
Since the 1970s, there has been a decline in the number of American men without college degrees in the US labor force. The last 50 years also saw their earnings stagnate and decrease.
By contrast, we're seeing women having a more secure footing in today's sort of more service post-industrial economy. And so we know that marriage is many things, but it's also in part a financial undertaking. And so when you have men who are losing ground financially in this working class demographic and women who are gaining ground, I think they both kind of see that the guy is less marriageable. And so they're less likely to kind of get married in the first place and more likely to get divorced in the second place.
You know, they're saying that the guy is less marriageable. It's kind of funny. I mean, it puts like the responsibility on the guy, but there's just been so much that's changed that's with the laws and with the way our society runs that I think it's not fair to put it all the way on the guy. I mean, in the prior world, it's like if a woman, you know, had a child out of wedlock, like that child was a bastard, an illegitimate child, and there was really no way to prove who the dad was in the first place. You know what I mean? It'd be really hard. You need a lot of witness testimony. There'd be a courtroom full of people saying, I saw these two, that guy put this in this person, you know what I mean? And all these kinds of things. And it was just really hard and expensive. But now we have genetic tests, and we have these other ways that kind of circumvent a lot of what marriage helped do in the first place. You know, marriage said, hey, these were children of these two people, regardless, legally, from the marriage. And it allowed passing on of wealth and all these kinds of things, and a responsibility and obligation from both people. But nowadays, you know, we got a child support program, we got family law, we got genetic testing, which can 100%, 99.99999% say, hey, that's the dad. Paternity and these kinds of issues and are kind of solved in a different way than how they were traditionally. So it's kind of circumvented the need for marriage in a way, which is kind of strange, honestly. So it's the laws, and it's given women especially different avenues to get what they want out of a marriage more so that makes it tougher for the guys. So it's not that guys aren't marriageable, but the system gives a lot of outs here for the women, and they have a much stronger advantage in this. It's just the situation.
Another phenomenon that affects marriage is the rise of secularism in modern societies. Here in the UK, for example, 1 in 3 people say they have no religion, up 25% since 2011. And this is a key reason why marriage is no longer the only basis for family formation.
I think that's a really, really important point. You know, I think there's still a lot of religious people on paper, but, you know, at the same time, we do live in a secular society. So that pressure, the societal pressure to keep two people together and monogamous just isn't there. The consequences aren't there the same way. So more people can bow out, you know. And it's one thing for the enforcement of the beliefs, but since the beliefs themselves have lost a lot of their charge, you know, what was once sacred to people, a lot of people don't consider sacred, or even if they give lip service to it, they're not living by it. And marriage is supposed to be one of these things that kind of have a huge religious, you know, foundation to it. And if people aren't really taking seriously what's sacred in their religion, how can they look at their own marriage as sacred? It's way more easy to just bow out and leave. I mean, it's hard to see the meaning of it and all these sort of traditional spiritual reasons for marriage. So marriage is taking a hit, man. It's taking a hit legally. It's taking a hit spiritually. It's not looking good. It's on the ground, and it's in the fetal position, and it's getting kicked repeatedly over and over again.
In 2021, 51% of births in the UK took place outside of a marriage. 42% of children in the European Union and 40% of children in the US are also born to unmarried parents.
So crazy. It's crazy that UK is even more than US. I'm kind of surprised by that. But yeah, 40% kids are born out of wedlock, and back in the day, that would be like really like that would be like a very shameful thing, especially if you're a woman. I mean, I think like 3 to 5% of kids were born out of wedlock in the US in 1950, and now it's at 40%. In 1975, you know, Congress was debating this problem because at that time it was around 24% of kids born out of wedlock, and that's what created the child support system. And, you know, out of all that debate, we got another program called the Voluntary Declaration of Paternity. So you had a lot of these kids being born out of wedlock to parents who weren't married. And the U.S. is like, what are we going to do? So they created this form that people sign at the hospital, or they can sign at a child support agency and all that stuff. But once two people sign it, usually at the hospitals where most of these get signed at, it is equivalent to the weight of a legal finding of paternity. So that was the kind of Band-Aid solution in order to make these kids not bastards and to say this person's the dad and this person's responsible, was the creation of that form as a solution, VDP, Voluntary Declaration of Paternity. And all the states have a version of this. They're required to. And that what's funny about that is that gives yet another avenue to circumvent the institution of marriage, because now it's like, even if you're a guy and like say you want a legal paternity of a child, I mean, or a mom, and you're like, I don't want to get married, but I want someone to be responsible for this kid, you could just sign that form, and that gets the paternity part taken care of, and then you don't got to worry about the rest of the marriage stuff that some people might not like.
For countries where this is acceptable socially, the decline in marriage does not necessarily spell trouble for the country's demographics. But in other parts of the world, most notably in East and South Asia, marriage and birth rates are highly correlated. Only 2.3% of babies are born outside of marriage in Japan, which means if people don't get married, they're also very unlikely to have children. This is a problem for Japan, the world's third largest economy and home to the world's oldest population.
That's actually really interesting. It's interesting that here in the US, people will not get married, but they'll still have a kid out of wedlock and just figure it out, you know, the independent, strong, single parent phenomena. But in Japan, they'll still live kind of similarly, but they will absolutely not have the kid if they're not married. I mean, that must have to do with like a sort of cultural shame surrounding being a single parent. I don't know what else could be responsible for that.
The fall in birth rate is something that happens in many countries. Governments all over the world are worried because of economic implications.
From state-funded matchmaking apps to marriage support concierges, the Japanese government has introduced several incentives to promote marriage, but so far nothing has worked.
There is this, financial constraint that people feel that they may not be able to support a family and raise children.
A similar problem is troubling authorities in neighboring China, which registered the fewest marriages in 2022 since public records began. The country also saw its birth rate fall to a record low the same year.
By 2050, China's working population will reduce by 10%, and not enough, babies born to fill that gap. And the, dependent population, those who reach retirement age, will double.
In a sharp...
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm kind of surprised by that, especially for like these other parts of the world, and kind of makes me wonder, like, what it really is. Their laws are maybe different from ours and all that, so why aren't they getting married? I don't know. Like, is it in the food? It's probably the economy as the biggest factor if people can't afford it. Could even be things like, I don't know, social media or the internet. People just go home and they're on their phones or their TV and watching stuff, and nobody's getting out. It's kind of crazy. Some of that with China might have been also affected by COVID, and just they were pretty strict on the COVID stuff. So maybe it's totally possible that everyone was just stuck inside, so no one was getting married. So we might even see their marriage rate come back up if it was just because of COVID restrictions.
A reversal from its former one-child policy, the Chinese government encourages marriage and childbirth since 2016. But this time, it's Chinese women who have reservations about married life.
And the women tend to spend significantly much more time than their husband in childcare and other related care. And also the Chinese workplace is not very women-friendly. And why women don't want to get married, why women don't want to have children, is because this society is not women-friendly, the society is not child-friendly.
Men talk about the personal freedom that they get for not getting married, but at the same time, they are really worried that if they were to set up a family, they will not be able to sustain a family with the income.
The Western heart is closing in an important extent to marriage and family life. And that's going to have a huge impact, not just economically, but also obviously socially and emotionally on young adults today.
I think it's something we've all kind of seen written on the walls. I know I've been seeing that since I was working at child support. I've read so many different divorce orders and saw how it's gone for people. And it's, I want to blame one thing or a couple of things, but it's a really, really complex issue. A lot of the women, and probably like in China too, they're career women. They want to work. They probably feel like it's a waste of their time. I feel like if marriage is going to work, I mean, people got to get married earlier in their lives. It's probably the better thing to do, especially if you're a woman, in terms of actually being able to have children. And if we're going to give marriage a shot out here, I mean, let's just say it's not completely done. I just think there's a lot of laws that need to change to really incentivize people to get married. Now that both genders are working, and it's different. It's just, I don't see why most guys would want to sign up for a very antiquated contract. You know what I mean? Where the law is going to get them, like if both people are working and they're making around the same money, then they just got to figure out a new way to do that. And maybe relaxing some of the laws out here will help, like originally marriage was meant for if you get married to someone, you guys have kids, you can hopefully have some, it wasn't the best guarantee, but it's supposed to be a guarantee that like, hey, these kids in this marriage are yours because, your wife's not supposed to be cheating on you. I think we should give guys an out for that. Like, hey, if you're married and the kids aren't yours, you have first right of undoing paternity if there was some kind of paternity fraud going on. And then it's up to the guy. The guy might have an emotional connection and say, I'll take care of this kid, and that's great. But if they really don't want to, then they shouldn't be forced to, because we have genetic tests that can go after the right person. And I also think there should be caps on spousal and child support. Like, there should be some maximum. Like, I don't ever think you should have like a $12,000 a month child support order. Like, these are things I've seen. I've seen very, very high spousal support orders with child support orders on there. So some people, like, whether or not, they're making money or not, it still just seems like a raw deal. And it works for both genders. I mean, as women start to make more money, this will help them out too. And it's got to seem like less of a risk and more just like a good idea. I love the comments under this video. I just had to look at them. Experienced divorce attorney here. Marriage is simply too big a risk in modern times. Divorce and family court can derail your life, even if you didn't do anything wrong. Better to live your best life and do the things that bring you joy. You can still have terrific relationships without inviting state laws into your life and finances. And hey, I gotta agree with the guy. I mean, I think most men feel similarly. Marriage is simply too financially costly. If you screw up and choose the wrong partner, it literally destroys you economically. My parents always told me never to marry. It's crazy when you got parents out here telling their kids that. My divorce cost me 170% of my net worth. Not only did he wipe me out, I owed, so we got ourselves a higher earner woman here. I owed over $60,000 to my lawyer. Yeah, the lawyer's fees just kill you. It took over a decade of hard work to get back on my feet. I am much happier as a single woman and wouldn't consider marriage again. Let's read one more. Let's just read one more. I'm a boomer and I was 32 when I got married, and my husband was 36. The idea of getting married was always so odd to me. It was something my parents' generation did, not something I and my friends did. It took me a couple of years to get used to referring to someone as my husband. We're now in our 60s, and I have at least 10 close friends my age who never married, and many others who never had children, and none of them regret their choices. I've always believed that my generation started the movement to avoid marriage. I mean, she's probably right. It was probably the boomers. Let me know what you think down below. Maybe you can leave a comment and tell us what your suggestion is on how to get marriage back on the up and up, and if there's a chance, or what you think people should be doing. And hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you on the next one.